But my main job right now is to introduce our speaker, and it is an honor and a pleasure to do that. Professor Amy Stuart Wells is the occupant this year of the Wayne Morse Chair. I'd also like to thank the U of O College of Education for its general co-sponsorship of this talk, as well as the Latino and Latina Law Student Association. Professor Wells is on the faculty of Columbia University Teachers College, where she is Professor of Sociology and Education in the Department of Education Policy and Social Analysis. Professor Wells has long-standing interests in racial equality and equity in education, school segregation, desegregation, resegregation, and policies related to charter schools and school choice. She's had a very distinguished research career, so I'm just going to mention a couple of current highlights. She directs The Public Good, a nonprofit dedicated to helping public schools tap into the educational benefits of racially diverse learning spaces through the use of qualitative research methods, public engagement, legal advocacy, and strategic communication. She also directs Reimagining Education, Teaching and Learning in Racially Diverse Public Schools. That's a summer institute for educators in demographically diverse urban and suburban schools. She is a member of the National Academy of Education and a fellow of the American Educational Research Association. Most of you know, I would suspect, that this particular campus, like many others, has been engaged in a very important conversation during at least the last year about access to higher education, racial justice, and exactly what those two things could, should, or might look like here at U of O. Oregon voters will also be making some very critical decisions on November 8th about the future of our state's public education system. So I can hardly think of a more timely speaker than Professor Amy Stuart Wells, who will be speaking to us on the topic of our children's burden, how public education can help sustain a diverse democracy. Please join me in welcoming her to the University of Oregon.
Thank you, Ellen. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I want to thank the Wayne Morse Center for inviting me, especially Margaret Halcott and Alan Herman and Rebecca Flynn, and for their hospitality. The Wayne Morse Historical Foundation for teaching me a lot about Wayne Morse and his legacy. The College of Education faculty and staff who've been so welcoming and warm, and the students are just tremendous. So I really enjoyed my time at the College of Ed. And the co-sponsors, the Latina Student Law Association. And it's a special honor for me to be the Wayne Morse Chair this year, because in reading more about Senator Morse and understanding his history, I've decided that we actually have quite a bit in common. So his focus on education, obviously, is the most obvious one, and his key role in passing federal legislation that created the educational system that we have today is central to that connection. But I also wanted to point out some other connections. Wayne Morse was born in the Midwest, as was I. We both left the Midwest for coasts, or we both did, either he did and I have also. We were both educated at Columbia University, that's our quad up there, that home of those mighty football Lions you may have heard of, with the longest losing streak ever. So I feel right at home here at the University of Oregon. Wayne Morse was also a Republican who then became an independent. I actually started off my adult life being a Republican because I was totally surrounded by Republicans in the Midwest. And I am no longer one either, as he evolved to be an independent and then a Democrat. I actually stayed an independent, but I mostly vote Democratic, especially this year, yes. So, and then finally just his determination and tenacity in terms of passing legislation his sense of his independence as a politician and not getting mired in politics. According to my son and most of my graduate students, I also have much determination, although on certain days they might use another word to describe that. But I feel as if Senator Morse and I are then soulmates of sorts, and so it's particularly an honor to be giving this lecture, and I've used this opportunity to really reflect back historically. I teach education policy and politics classes at Teachers College, as well as sociology classes, and so I'm always trying to merge the two and think about the sociology of the history of American education, and particularly as it relates to issues of race. So I'm going to think about his legacy in terms of the key federal legislation that he helped to pass, and the role of that federal legislation in shaping the educational system that we have today. I'm aware that as the chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Education from 1961, which was actually the year I was born, see all these links we have? We're so in sync. Until 1968, Senator Morse was, as I was told, was called Mr. Education on Capitol Hill. All of these federal laws made the common school more common by expanding access and opportunity to serve more children across all 50 states. This was no easy task, not back in the 50s and certainly not, or in 60s, and certainly not today. So I'm going to say a little preamble here. This is a quote from then Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare before we had our own Department of Education, commenting on Senator Morse's role in passing federal education legislation. And for those of us who know the history, that particular era when the federal role expanded was a symbolic and important one. So I'm going to talk more about that role and how and its impact on issues of access, equity, and race in education. I'm going to take a moment just to reflect on what the American public education system is today and what it means and why we should look back to move forward. So, American public education is uniquely American. It is locally controlled for the most part and highly decentralized across 50 states, 15,000 local school districts. These districts differ tremendously in terms of their size, the numbers of schools, the numbers of students, but also in terms of their per pupil funding, from as low as $7,000 per pupil per year to as high as almost $30,000 in districts near me in New York. The student demographics also vary tremendously, from virtually all white to exclusively students of color. In the New York City public schools, where we have 1.1 million students, there are more than 150 languages spoken in the homes of our children. The curriculum and type of instruction offered by various states, varies by state, district, school, and classroom, making the public education system not so common across the individual desks that the 50 million public school students occupy. But at its very basic level, the Institute of Public Education in America, now more than 150 years old, is a symbol of our commitment as a society to each other. And once we fail that commitment, I argue, a democratic society cannot hold. In other words, public education is an institution in service, theoretically, of the greater good, of a voting public that is engaged and understands the issues at stake, of a working public in which all students learn valuable skills required in the current labor market, and a caring public in which we support families and children because we know that passing on, that giving and nurturing the next generation is important for a healthy society, and that is important for all of us. Like the U.S. military, the Social Security system, our national parks and forests, and like our highways and bridges, public education is supported by all of us collectively, and it is available to all our children regardless of creed, color, religion, or country or of national origin. And while public education is not equal enough across local and state boundaries, it is universal, and it is a state constitutional right in all 50 states. It's an institution that at its core forces us to think beyond our own individual experience, beyond our own children, and our own private wealth and material needs, to see a public that is part of all of us, a public that is needed to sustain all of us. It symbolizes our interdependence, at least at the local level. And to engage, we must share, we must trust, we must care, we must give, we must believe, or we don't. So I'm going to argue tonight that we can only achieve a meaningful public education system and equal educational opportunity in the U.S. if we consider both tangible and intangible resources, and I'm going to talk more about what that means. So our efforts to equalize that system, if we believe it is vital for a democracy, must focus not only on equalizing bricks and mortar and books, but also on voice and values. So I'm going to explain, going back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, why I titled this talk Our Children's Burden, which some people would think is slightly pessimistic. And it is, because I'm going to focus on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which Senator Morse was a part of. And Section 8 of Title 4 of the Civil Rights Act required the U.S. Department of Education, to authorize a survey of segregation by race, color, religion, or national origin in public education. So as part of that Civil Rights Act, that research was done on the educational system. So this became what is known as the Coleman Report. So many of you have probably heard of the Coleman Report. Those of us who are older definitely have heard of the Coleman Report. So it was a famous report, and it was probably one of the most broadly cited pieces of educational research, one of the first broad-based pieces of educational research on the availability of equal educational opportunities in public schools for minority groups, Negroes, Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans, this is all the language describing, Oriental Americans and American Indians, as compared with opportunities for the majority group of whites. So notable among the findings, there were many findings. This was also very statistically sophisticated for its time. If you do statistics now and you looked at it, you would laugh, but it was actually quite a breakthrough in terms of methodology in the field of education. But notable among the findings of this survey were that Negro students and teachers are largely and unequally segregated from their white counterparts, and that the average minority pupil achieves less and is more affected by the quality of his school than the average white pupil. So interestingly enough, this finding, even though the report didn't show what a lot of people thought it would show, a lot of inequality in terms of tangible resources across black and white schools, it actually did show that desegregation or racial diversity was beneficial, particularly for African American students. This created then more political support for actually implementation of the Civil Rights Act and what would follow. So the lesser known product of Section 8 of Title 4 of the Civil Rights Act is another report, a companion report, that was called Our Children's Burden. And it was studies of desegregation in 9 American communities. Basically, it was looking at the quality of 9 different communities that varied in terms of their economic bases, varying political structures, separate historical traditions, and many religions and national backgrounds that are woven into the fabric of our society. So these case studies were undertaken as a supplement to the massive statistical survey designed and administered by James Coleman, hence the Coleman Report. And what Ray Mack, who was the editor and the chief of this study, the chief the principal investigator said, is that I hope that we might put flesh on the bones of the survey data by learning something from observation and interviews about definitions of situations and the interactional context of the data sought by the survey methods. So for those of us who do qualitative research, that's kind of nice. So basically he's saying the Coleman Report will show you a lot of numbers. Our research will tell you about the experiences of students in schools. So there were many key findings. This was actually different case studies. Each chapter is a different case study of a different community that was racially diverse in terms of its school system at that time. And the 2 key main findings were that Negroes equated desegregated education with improved education, and see both as providing access to the American dream of economic prosperity coupled with respect for one's personal worth. So this finding about personal worth is a very key point throughout the studies of these 9 communities. So in other words, it's very similar to a quote I'm going to show later about desegregation can provide access for African American students at this time to schools with more resources, more opportunities, as long as it came with respect for their personal worth. The second finding was that Americans are asking their children to bear the brunt of a difficult social process of desegregation. Those two things go together, hence the title of the book, Our Children's Burden. So what Mac was trying to say was that desegregation is not just about moving children around and creating racial diversity. It's about respecting the personal worth of every child. And by the way, we completely put this burden on our children in public schools. Yes, we desegregated the military, but we haven't done much with our housing, right? We haven't done much with our communities. At that time, we hadn't done really anything around employment opportunities. And so we put the entire burden of desegregating our society on the public schools and the children within them. So I'm going to think about this burden that we placed on our children across these three different eras and argue that today we are also placing a burden on our children. And I think because of the potential of public education that they have an important role to play in this future, but they can't do it alone. So I'm going to look at the burden in terms of public education as an exception to American exceptionalism. I'm going to talk about the burden as making good on the promise of public schools, so the era of desegregation. And I'm going to talk about the centrality and fragility of public education today and efforts to create more diverse schools. So I'm not going to go too much into the entire history of the American public education system, but it's important to know that it was started in the middle of the 19th century, and that the idea, this is Horace Mann, he became the Secretary of Education in Massachusetts. And it was his vision to have a common school, so that the common school would be free, they would not be charged tuition as the schools prior to the common school often had. It would be universal or open to all children, although this did not include usually black students or white students with strange beliefs such as Irish Catholics. So all is an interesting term. And it would improve efficiency and assimilate students via a common learning experience. So this goal of assimilation was very important, and it's important too to think about that in relation to some of the findings around desegregation. So the common school was also affiliated with the Whig Party. This actually reminded me of Senator Morse and the legislation in the middle of the 20th century that created a more centralized education system. But a major goal of this Whig Party effort to centralize was also to assimilate, to create one common sense of morality. And in fact, the moral lessons were the most important aspect of teaching in the common school. So moral in this Protestant Republican view of moral, right, which did not include Irish Catholics, people of color. So this was the main project of the common school at the time. But at the same time, there was an equalization of resources. There was opening up of access in terms of students who couldn't afford to go. So there was these two things going on. So how does this relate then in terms of our children's burden? Well, the other thing to remember about the history of America is that we have something that we've known as American exceptionalism. In other words, during the era when social welfare states were being created in European countries, the Americans were very much opposed to a robust social welfare system, okay? But what we were creating instead was a public education system, arguing that the public schools should create the equality of the system, that we didn't need things like socialized medicine, we didn't need greater access to child care and other resources of a social welfare state. What we needed was public education. So throughout the 20th century, while governments in other industrialized nations built and enlarged a comprehensive social welfare system that included health care, child care, preschool, pensions, housing, labor to support families and women and children, as they often talked about it, the U.S. policymakers at the federal, state, and local level invested in public education instead, with relatively few support services for other social welfare policies. So in the United States, this was seen as a central component of the American notion of welfare. The idea that through education, through personal betterment, and national and social economic development would take place. That we didn't need those other services because we were providing a free universal public education. So in questioning kind of why that is, what is it about the US culture and history that explains our exceptionalism? There's a lot of cultural, historical issues related to independence, self-reliance, this sense of hard work, pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, rugged individualism, and a strong commitment to self-help as opposed to help from the government. So these are themes that we still see and hear today, including in the current election. So this bootstrap ideology, yeah, John Wayne, no. The sense that we could pull ourselves up without the help of a social welfare net. And according to some scholars, the reason why politics evolved in the US in this way was strongly influenced and shaped by racial politics in terms of the nature of public policies and programs. So the central reason the US was slow to enact national welfare programs founded in other countries, such as the health insurance, the family allowance, paid paternity leave, was at the time these policies became unpopular, that they were becoming more popular abroad, race had moved into the center of policymaking in the US. So it's important just to review quickly what that looks like across these different eras, this history of racial politics and where the educational system and the burden that we put on children is located. So in the New Deal the New Deal era is often considered to be the exception to American exceptionalism. So the pure bootstrap ideology was suspended at a time of severe economic and social needs during the Great Depression. So the argument at this time was you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you don't have any bootstraps. So there was this centralization of this expanding federal role, this centralization of the development of social welfare policy, and the federal government expanded to respond to the economic desire. So when a series of progressive public policies were passed, this era and these policies were referred to as the New Deal era. So it was an anomaly. It was considered an anomaly in American history because of the establishment of these social welfare policies, also known as the safety net to hold people up in hard times. So these are some different examples of the way in which those were promoted and supported. The different work programs that were created, all to help support and sustain families in a way that had not been occurring in the US prior to that. So housing vouchers, for example. So the exclusion of Blacks and Latinos from these New Deal social welfare policies were an important part of that history. So it's important to think now about comparative literature on social welfare policies in the US and in other countries, and the relationship to diversity within the democracy and the support for social welfare policies. Going back in history to this one era when there were more such policies created, there was a systematic exclusion of Blacks and Latinos. The other thing that was missing in the New Deal era was much expansion of the educational system. So in contrast with the New Deal era, when there was much more focus on the social welfare policies and much less focus on education at a time when the vast majority of Americans were struggling economically, we need to think about the Great Society era and LBJ. So the Great Society era from the mid-60s to the mid-70s placed much more emphasis on the role of education as opposed to cash transfer programs such as Social Security or unemployment insurance to help lift people out of poverty. So there were several different factors that if you're comparing the context of the New Deal era to the Great Society era. So during the 60s and 70s, there was an expanding economy. There were well-paying jobs for white male workers in particular, low poverty rates for whites, Black migration into the cities through the middle of the 20th century, white migration to the suburbs, those were synchronized, black segregation in urban areas and a shrinking job base, and the concentration of poverty. So just to summarize some of that, I'm sure you're all aware that the black migration, and by the way, this was one of the Jacob Lawrence paintings from the migration. Then there was just a great exhibit in New York of all the paintings from that series. But it was the single most important internal migration in the history of the world, and now being paralleled with the migration of the Chinese from the rural to the urban areas. So 5 million blacks left rural areas in the south and headed to the north. When blacks arrived in the north, there was systematic movement of whites into suburbs. Those were all, as I'm sure many of you have studied, supported by federal policies that made home ownership in the suburbs possible. So during this era, as the support for public education was growing as a solution to urban poverty that was very much racialized and very distinct and different from New Deal poverty, there was a push to expand public education. So this was often termed as a hand up and not a hand out. So real distinction to social welfare policies that would support families economically. The answer was through education. So this is the era in which the federal role in public education expanded tremendously, and Senator Morse was a very important part of that, because public education was seen as the solution to poverty during that era. So just as we saw an expanding federal role during the New Deal era, we saw an expanding federal role in this era, but focused much more specifically on education and job training. So, as we well know, the Brown versus Board of Ed decision was passed and was ruled on in 1954. We know that the Brown 2 decision was in 1955, which called for desegregation in all deliberate speed. We also know quickly, I'm just running through this history because it's long, from the late 1950s to the early 1960s, most Southern schools remained racially segregated. There was massive resistance to desegregation and much deliberation with no speed. This is where the Civil Rights Act of 1964 comes in again in an important way, coinciding with the rise of federal investment and support for public education. So we know that the Civil Rights Act specifically targeted action towards desegregating public schools, because from 1954 with Brown versus Board of Ed until 1964, very little desegregation had occurred. So this was actually how it talked about school desegregation in Title IV. And most importantly, in Title VI, it said that federal assistance could not be granted to programs that were discriminating based on race. So this was important because the education legislation that Senator Morse was a part of starting the next year in terms of K through 12 education increased the federal funding for public education significantly. So this act along with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which bore Senator Morse's name, was important to actually forcing school districts to desegregate. So this is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that was passed in 1965, the Bilingual Education Act that was passed in 1968, Special Education, which was passed in 1972, the Higher Education Act of 1965, and the Head Start program, which also began in 1965, and the Brown versus Board of Ed. So the court cases that were happening through the federal government using both the carrot of funding and resources and the stick of the court cases to try to establish more open access for students in public education. So Title IX of the Civil Rights Act authorized the Justice Department to intervene in any case involving equal protection laws in the 14th Amendment. This led to 350 federal school desegregation cases and thousands of what I call desegregation plans. So desegregation, I use that term because this was the process of putting students of different racial ethnic backgrounds together in the same schools. What it didn't accomplish was integration, and that's a very important part of thinking about what happened when we put the burden of desegregation completely on the public schools. So we've learned a lot from that era of desegregation about how we should think about these issues moving forward. So we learned, for instance, that putting kids together and sharing resources and opportunities did lead to some positive outcomes, and that separate is inherently unequal in the field of education. So we know that from many years of research on the harms of segregation, that segregation has harms particularly for Black and Hispanic students in terms of high concentration of poverty, lack of qualified teachers, and high teacher turnover in segregated Black and Latino schools, lack of challenging curriculum and other educational resources that often comes in segregated schools, low expectations and less powerful social networks, low academic performance, graduation rates, and college-going rates, and lack of political support for public education. So we don't often think about that as very segregated school districts that whites have fled often, as we're seeing them in urban areas and some suburban areas, often lack the political support needed within the communities and from outside. So we also learned from the research that desegregation did improve Black and Latino student outcomes and opportunities for mobility in spite of what was happening often inside of the schools. So there were academic gains overall when you aggregate the research. Black and Hispanic students gained in terms, the achievement gap between white and Black students in particular closed more during the period of implementation of school desegregation than any other period. The racial, so the long-term effects of students in terms of greater access to powerful social networks led to greater mobility of students. Desegregation also, according to research, improved racial attitudes and racial understandings of all students. The greater acceptance of others, especially for white students, is seen in this data, social psychological research showing these kinds of outcomes. Increased comfort level and interracial contact and deeper intercultural understanding. But that wasn't enough. That wasn't enough. So just looking at the outcomes missed what was in the story of the study that Ray Mack conducted. Desegregation was necessary but not sufficient. Too little was done to address these cultural issues within schools and understandings of whose knowledge was valued in desegregated schools. So we know that Black schools were closed and Black teachers lost their jobs. Most oftentimes Black students were sent to predominantly white schools. We know that Black and Hispanic students were sent to these schools where teachers were told they should not talk about race. The research I did on desegregated high schools during the 1970s found that teachers were told they were not explicitly not supposed to talk about race in desegregated schools. This is a quote from one of the teachers that said, "We emphasized the fact that we were not emphasizing the color of skin." And that came from a white math teacher in the 1970s, desegregated high school. Now you have to understand these case studies that I did of these schools were in contexts where there had been complete racial segregation prior to the desegregation. So to put students together in a classroom and tell the teachers and the students we're not going to talk about race was a real missed opportunity in terms of thinking about how we move towards a more integrated society. As far as the teaching went, the curriculum didn't change in these schools. It didn't start to affect the canon, as one teacher said. We were still teaching dead white men for a long, long time. And this led to a lot of what we call second generation issues. The resegregation of students into separate and unequal classrooms, the disproportionality in terms of student discipline and punishment and assignment to special education for students of color, denial of bilingual educational services for many Latino students in desegregated schools. And this is a quote, this is actually from a very important article written by W.E.B. Du Bois in the 1930s. It could have been written yesterday, where he's asking whether the Negro needs neither segregated schools nor mixed schools. What he needs is education. He says a school with poor and unsympathetic teachers, with hostile public opinion and no teaching of truth concerning Black folks is bad. A segregated school with ignorant placeholders, inadequate equipment, poor salaries, wretched housing is equally bad. So what he goes on to say is that all things being equal, the more integrated school is better, but things are seldom equal. So what he's trying to underscore here, and what the MAC report was trying to underscore in the 1960s, was that we can't just put children together in a building and expect that to be the way we desegregate, right? We need to really focus on these sociocultural issues. We need to focus on curriculum and teaching. We need to focus on racial attitudes of teachers and students. So that goes back to these different ways we want to think about what we want to think about when we desegregate. So I'm not really wild about this photo, but one of my students thought it was really cute. But the idea of material resources, which is what we often focus on, and for those of us who have read the Brown versus Board of Education decision, there's a discussion throughout this and the cases that preceded it in higher education on these tangible factors, these material resources. So equalizing books, equalizing access to facilities, those are tangible things that we can touch. What's less discussed, but was also mentioned in the Brown decision and in the higher ed cases that preceded it, was these intangible factors, which the Supreme Court doesn't talk about in this way, but which, if you translate into the research in the field of education, would be whose voice and whose knowledge is valued in schools, whose perspective is valued, who feels that they belong to a school. So what I've been arguing and thinking about, and this relates back to the MAC book, Our Children's Burden, is that we need to really be focusing on both, right? And our history, and throughout the history of desegregation, we mainly focused on material resources, including access to buildings and access to schools that African American and Latino students had been denied access to before. But what we weren't focusing on enough was on these intangible factors. And that's our burden moving forward. So to think that through, we actually did a very long report, which I can send to anyone who wants it, that was just published by the Century Foundation on educational benefits of diversity. And we drew a lot from the research on higher education. So the debates going on here at the U of O, the debates going on across the country in colleges and universities about affirmative action, and the research that supports those court cases on educational benefits of diverse classrooms. And some of that's been studied also in K through 12, but most of the powerful research comes from higher ed. And what those findings show is that there are enhanced learning outcomes for all students being in diverse classrooms. Of course, this again depends on how the classroom is structured and the pedagogy, but improved cognitive skills relate to challenging your own assumptions when working in diverse groups or having a dialogue with a diverse group of students. Increased intercultural and cross-racial knowledge, understanding, and empathy. Decreased implicit bias is one of the findings that comes out, which is very helpful in terms of both those who hold the bias and those who are the recipients of the bias. Some of this research shows that if you hold implicit bias, it actually takes a lot of energy and fear and frustration inside of you, that if you actually move past it, it helps you learn and be more open and more comfortable in different settings and transcending different cultural boundaries. Students who go to more racially diverse universities and schools actually leave those schools with a better sense of of the greater good, and a stronger sense of, a broader sense of what our society is and these democratic processes within a more diverse society. So the other thing that's important to think about is the way in which higher education now, with all the tours that we go on, all the college campus tours we go on, talk about diversity and inclusion as an asset, as something that's important to creating an educational community that allows students to learn across racial, religious, ethnic, international, and intercultural lines, and that they tout it as a benefit of their institutions. Which is always interesting to me, as I mentioned, when I was sitting with my son through some of these info sessions and looking at students around me coming from high schools that were probably very segregated racially, as we've seen segregation increase. So this takes us to kind of the third and final way of thinking about our children's burden as we move forward, and the centrality and fragility of public education today. So part of that has to do with the educational policy context in K through 12 education for the last 30 years, which is creating an accountability system based on standardized testing, and measuring all schools and all students based on test scores. At the same time, allowing segregation to reoccur in a lot of public places and to be maintained in many other places. So we have more separate and unequal schools today than we did prior to the Brown decision in many metropolitan areas. And at the same time, we're using these measures of testing and focusing on outcome, which has narrowed our curriculum and narrowed what we think is important in the field of public education in a way that I believe has moved us away from thinking about diversity in educational context as a benefit. So in the last, I would say, 5 years, based on my perspective, we've seen a sudden kind of change and an increased interest in addressing this current situation. And there's several different reasons for that, I think. But the media has taken it up, for one, in case you haven't noticed. We talk a lot more now about, I just was on the phone this afternoon with another reporter writing about this in Montgomery County, Maryland. Issues of race and socioeconomic segregation are suddenly back in the news and on the political radar screen. John King, our short-term Secretary of Education, has made this a top priority as well, proposing the Stronger Together federal legislation after many years of the federal government ignoring issues of race in education. So the question is, why now? And what should we do about it? So I think there are a lot of different social causes that are leading to us kind of thinking this through again at this moment in history. The changing demographics of the country, and particularly the K through 12 population, changing racial attitudes, at least people talking the talk of more acceptance of diverse communities and schools. That doesn't always mean that they mean it when they are enrolling their children. Changing migration patterns. So this is something we've been focusing a lot on at Columbia. Changing cities and changing suburbs. So we call it the metro migration pattern. So I'm going to talk through each of these, and I'll try to be brief because I'm taking a lot of time. So the changing demographics, you all are probably as aware of that as anyone. More racial and ethnic diversity. Less than half of the students in the public school population today are white non-Hispanic students. That's in contrast to about 78% of the students back in the 1970s. So we've seen a real decrease in the percentage of white students in the student population and increase in foreign-born students as well. That has to do with the changing population of the nation as a whole. The higher birth rates among parents of color. So we have more babies of color born than the U.S. white non-Hispanic babies in 2013. And this has obviously impacted the public education system. Changing public school enrollments over time are becoming more and more diverse. The millennial generation, I think this is another factor that's underreported, but I see it a lot in the research I'm doing on parents of public school kids today. So that cohort of incoming public school parents are more diverse, they're more likely to be in interracial marriages, and they're more open to living in interracial communities. Changing racial attitudes, at least at what we're documenting in survey data, which I know, having done a lot of interviews with white people in particular, doesn't mean that's actually the way it is in terms of their day-to-day experiences, but at least reporting of more openness to interracial marriage and interracial communities. Again, a huge increase in number of Americans who say they would live in a community composed of a mix of racial and ethnic groups. Racial attitudes in terms of racially diverse schools have changed over time. Recent surveys suggest that 71% of all respondents felt that increasing diversity and integration in public education is important to their improvement. The other things I think that are important that are affecting this change is what I call testing fatigue, which relates to the opting out movement. Parents frustrated with all the testing and thinking that their children are more than a test score. And we ought to broaden the way we think about curriculum in public education, and only one way to be smart. We're certainly seeing a lot of that in New York. And then people are moving. So there are areas of the country that are becoming more diverse in a very de facto sort of way. So this relates to federal housing policies going back the last 20 years, Bush the first, Clinton, Bush the second, pushing for home ownership for more lower income families, which then, of course, led to the whole mortgage lending crisis, which we're not going to talk about tonight. But this did also shift the demographics of the suburbs, with more blacks, Latinos, and Asians moving to the suburbs. At the same time, federal policies were laying the groundwork for gentrification in the cities through empowerment zones, enterprise zones, which then led to gentrification and the return to cities of many white young adults whose grandparents had fled those very same neighborhoods after World War II. So I'm now interviewing parents whose grandparents fled the same communities in Brooklyn that they're living in today, 2 generations ago. It's like what goes around comes around, right? So the very meaning of urban versus suburban is changing. This whole paradigm of, of white suburbs and cities, urban areas being mostly black and Latino is changing rapidly in the US across many metro areas. This has been called the Great Inversion. And there are several, you can map the policies that help to create this change. So again, suburbs are changing quickly, becoming more and more diverse. We are seeing these patterns of resegregation occur as white families leave diversifying suburbs, but we're also seeing moments of hope. This was just a quote from the research we're doing with one of the school districts in Westchester County, talking about a meeting in Albany with the school boards, the School Boards Association, and the suburban educators in particular talking about the changing demographics of their communities, but they're truly interested in doing the best possible to help all children succeed, to honor children as families, and to maintain high expectations for all. That was one school board member's interpretation. But it's a trend that's happening. Suburban educators are more and more attuned to this. It's happening all over the country. Changing suburbs, changing cities. This is a little joke about bingo for gentrification. Whether you have cappuccino or nannies in the park is a sign that another area of Brooklyn is becoming gentrified, or Harlem, which is where I live. So according to the 2010 census data, Black residents of New York City declined for the first time since the Civil War, while the growth in Hispanic and Asian populations slowed significantly. And then we're seeing large growth. 2015, I believe, was the first year there was an increase in white babies born in Manhattan. So examples of gentrification also relate to property values and who's excluded. So the consequences of these metro migration patterns, as we call them, changing suburbs, changing cities, is that it can create spaces for more diverse cities and suburbs, or it can lead to highly segregated, separate, and unequal pockets, both within the cities and the suburbs. So this is a very not funny cartoon that shows kind of the last 2 centuries of, or last century of metro migration patterns. So it shows white flight. Whites flee to the suburbs, whites move to second ring suburbs, minorities move into the first ring suburbs, whites move back into cities. So we want to try to avoid that pattern, which is a pattern of resegregation. So public education is very critical to that. It's to sustain some of these diverse communities, both in suburban areas and in urban areas. So that's where we're doing our work, and we're trying to learn from that history of race and education, of our children's burden, to try to move forward. So we're building on the educational benefits of diverse schools and classrooms and using what the research showed us to help us think through how do we create diverse public schools for the 21st century. This is no easy task. Some of the policy changes that would need to take place in order to support the work that we're doing at the grassroots level is thinking about accountability for diversity. Why do we consider racially isolated public schools, especially all white and privileged schools, to be good schools in the 21st century, particularly given what we're hearing on the college campuses when we go on the tours? Why aren't K-12 policymakers, officials, and educators building on the argument put forth by the universities related to affirmative action cases? And how can we change the paradigm to embrace the new public for public education? So this is a graphic that we've created for our project that would show the different things that need to happen, which is kind of too small to read, but I think the graphic's pretty cool, to create more diverse and inclusive suburbs and urban areas. And then we conducted the Summer Institute, as Ellen mentioned, and I have a video which I could show if people want to see it later. I'm not sure the link is going to work on this computer, but it was a 4-day Summer Institute that we created to help train educators for working in diverse schools. So it was this combination of doing your own racial identity work and thinking through sociocultural issues as it relates to who you are as an educator, and then some real concrete lessons and strategies to be using in racially diverse schools across different grade levels and different subject matters. So if I get the chance, I can show you all the video. There was some really good feedback, and we're going to try to do it again next year. So come to New York in July. The other thing we're doing is this public good project that Ellen mentioned, where we're actually using community engagement strategies and strategic communication around issues of diversity and race and privilege and power in racially diverse public schools. We're tying that to professional development for educators that relates to the Summer Institute and all the work that needs to be done in schools and classrooms. And we also have legal advocacy that we're working with New York City on student assignment policies. We have these incredibly diverse pockets of New York, and we need to align the student assignment policies so that we're not just creating segregated schools in very diverse boroughs and neighborhoods. So to take this back to Senator Morse, an important quote of one of his important quotes is that the duty laid upon us is to open the widest the door of education to all who have an innate capacity to step over that threshold. So I think he wouldn't mind if I then translate it into my 21st century understanding based on the lessons I've learned. That when we want to open that door, we want to think of greater access to tangible resources, but not greater assimilation, which was the model of the common school era. So our children's burden is to broaden voice, value, and intercultural understanding in racially, ethnically, and diverse public schools. Thank you.